From the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Houston, Texas, this is Baker Briefing. I'm Ed Emmett. I'm a Baker Institute Fellow in Energy and Transportation Policy. And here at the Baker Institute, we tackle the most critical foreign and domestic policy issues of the day. Today's topic, Latin American energy and politics. Now, for those of us who spent pretty much our entire life in the United States, when we think about energy resources, we think about the U.S. and we think about the Middle East. But in fact, outside of the Middle East, Latin America represents the largest energy resource base in the world. And I think that would be a surprise to a lot of people. The region contains vast amounts of untapped resources, including crude oil, natural gas. But you can't talk about energy policy without talking about politics, because that's what makes things happen. And Latin America has had, shall we say, a distinctive political landscape over the years. I don't know if it makes it a significant player or it just makes it a different player, but it does clearly color how energy policy develops. We have a lot to talk about today, but we have two outstanding panelists, so I'm pleased to welcome Baker Institute colleagues as Mark Jones, Fellow in Political Science, and Francisco Monaldi, Fellow in Latin American Energy Policy. We're going to start with you, Mark. Let's set the stage a little bit. Talk about the political landscape in Latin America. And I know that may be a little bit difficult because it's not one thing. I mean, you've got different countries, obviously. But what are some of the overarching trends that you see that are currently defining the region and that will have an impact on energy policy going forward?
Okay. Well, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all. I think if I was thinking about that question, I would probably go back to, let's go back to say 1980, 1979, and what's Latin America look like then? With the exception of Venezuela and Costa Rica, we have dictatorships pretty much across the board. Some are military dictatorships. Cuba is a communist dictatorship, but democracy is not doing well. Under the Reagan administration, Secretary Baker played a role in that, as well as under President Bush. We saw the promotion of democracy throughout the Americas. And by the late 80s, with Chile's election in 1988 on the referendum, and then 1989, pretty much every country other than Cuba was a democracy, or Haiti, but Haiti's just always a basket case. But the rest of the region was all democratic. So if we were thinking about democratic optimism, the 80s and 90s tended to be pretty optimistic. That is, Latin America was increasingly democratic. Places like El Salvador that had experienced war or had essentially resolved to compete at the ballot box. We had Alberto Fujimori's auto golpe in Peru in the 90s, but by and large, democracy was the law of the land, and most of the countries were democratic in supporting economic policies that, were not neoliberal under the Washington Consensus, were at least relatively productive. Then, of course, like everything happens in Latin America, the pendulum began to swing the other way. We saw the neoliberal reforms in the Washington Consensus lead to a rise in governments of the left. In some countries like Venezuela, don't need to tell a lot of people here, it resulted going from democracy to dictatorship. Something similar occurred in Bolivia. It was stopped momentarily with Evo Morales, but sort of has continued. Nicaragua's gone down that route. And today we find ourselves in a situation where we have the traditional party systems and democracies that used to sort of be, you could rely on throughout the region, are essentially crumbling. Chile, which was the golden child for so many years, has lost the luster and now is run by Gabriel Boric, who comes from the Communist Party, but the idea of the sort of stable coalitions is no longer there. Costa Rica, which historically had a strong party system, that's broken up. AMLO has taken over in Mexico. We have to look for places where parties are still the same and you have stability and democracy. We have only little Uruguay left, and at the end of the day, Uruguay doesn't really matter. Nice country, nice place, great people, but energy, it's irrelevant, and even as an actor, it's irrelevant. Paraguay has somehow kept things pretty simple, straightforward as well, but it's also not very democratic. So I think today where we find ourselves in Latin America is a combination of increasingly weak democratic governments, both in the traditional basket cases, the Perus, the Ecuadors, the Haitis, but also countries that in the past had more stability are now experiencing some of the problems of their neighbors. That would be Argentina, and Chile would be sort of two examples of that. And in Mexico, I think we're looking ahead at a pretty divisive 2024 with whatever the outcome is, it's going to be bad politically.
Well, that's certainly not a boring landscape that you've described. Seems like constantly changing. And so country by country, that change is going to continue. I guess instability would be a word that could be used.
I think a lot of instability, but also where no one's ever successful. And so what you have a lot of is a government that's a little to the left, tries, it fails, you move to the right, it fails, move back to the left. And in some cases, you get off the rails democratically, as Venezuela saw, as Nicaragua saw, as Bolivia has kind of seen. Or you follow sort of the El Salvador path, where you effectively have now an elected dictator, Nayib Bukele, who is extremely popular. He has 90% approval ratings, but he's achieved that by essentially ending the Constitution and any sort of constitutional guarantees. It's not a good situation for democracy in the region, and no government has really been all that successful for an extended period of time, which tends to lead to these transitions, but they're transitions of models where they start from scratch. Things crash and burn, you start from scratch. And sometimes you can get 1 or 2 terms if global economic winds help you, as they help a lot of the governments that had the good fortune to be in office in the late 2000s, early 2000s with the commodities boom, were able to sort of win re-election. But that was just because they were in a great time, essentially, in terms of overall revenue. Once that revenue went away, they lost.
Okay, Francisco, now that Mark has sort of set the political stage, named the actors, described what's going on there. What's the impact on energy, not just policy, but energy resource development? What's your overall view of that?
Yeah, well, as you pointed out at the beginning, energy and politics are very linked, but in Latin America more than in other places, in the sense that a lot of the obstacles for the development of the resources have been what in the industries are called above ground risk, sort of political risk, resource nationalism, and the like. The region has, as you mentioned, the largest resource base in terms of hydrocarbons outside of the Middle East, and it has tremendous potential in critical minerals too, but it has been significantly underdeveloped. I mean, the most extreme case is Venezuela, with some of the largest resources in the world and producing only 700,000 barrels per day, when it used to be the largest exporter of the world in the 1960s, for example. But also other countries, even the most successful ones, which recently is Brazil and the newcomer, Guyana. Brazil could be producing even more oil than it is producing today. And just to give you an idea, the US plus Canada produce about 18 million barrels of oil per day with less resources than Latin America. Latin America used to produce 11, 15 years ago, it produces 8 today. The good news is that Guyana and Brazil are going to increase in the next few years, and the region as a whole will, for the first time in a long time, increase its share of world oil production. But in the rest of the countries in the region, the development is very limited. And the main issue has been this combination of resource nationalism, the dominance of national oil companies that plenty of times are not well run and that limit the capacity of the industry to develop the resources, and these sort of cycles in which we have had, expropriations, nationalizations, changing in contracts. The only 2 countries that could say in Latin America that they had not forcefully renegotiated or confiscated or expropriated an oil contract, which were Brazil and Colombia, just have done it in the last 2 years. That's, changing the contractual rules. So that's a big limitation and a big problem for the region.
Okay, so we have all these underutilized, undertapped carbon resources. At the same time, now we have an energy transition going on around the globe. I'll throw that out to both of you. How does that play into the politics? Because understanding that national leaders like to have revenue coming in, and clearly the carbon resources would generate that revenue, but at the same time, we're moving away from that. So how does that play? And whichever one wants to take that first.
Yeah, well, one of the concerns is that you have a bunch of countries that are highly dependent on hydrocarbons. Even though they haven't developed the full potential, they are dependent, meaning that they haven't diversified or produced other types of resources or industries. And that's a challenge because, as you point out, the energy transition is ongoing, and even if you develop, and Latin America is developing, for example, renewables, the shares of renewables in the region just 15 years ago was like 4%. Now it's about 20%. And we have 40% of hydro in Latin America. But the challenge is that these are not industries that will generate fiscal revenues like oil and gas did. So in ongoing talks with the IMF about their concerns about what the implications that this will have for the macroeconomy in the region. So that's one factor. The other issue is that the renewables require a very strong institutional framework and contractual framework, et cetera. And we have seen some concerning developments, like, for example, the contract cancellation or forced renegotiation in Mexico by López Obrador, which is very concerning because Mexico was one of the countries that was advancing the fastest in the energy transition. But this is a very significant setback that highlights that in this space also, political risk could be an obstacle.
Before you take that on, Mark, let me add one more little piece to it. In upcoming elections, how will energy policy play? Will it be a dominant factor or not?
Well, I guess on what Francisco was talking about, I think we're in a situation where a lot of political leaders know that the time is limited. So I think there is a view that there is like an expiration date on their hydrocarbon resources, that if they stay in the ground for too long, they'll stay in the ground forever. At the same time, there's also the inherently short-term vision of most of those political leaders, that they can't see 10 or 20 years down the road. But one of the areas where renewables have an advantage over oil and natural gas is that you don't have mass consumption of lithium or copper in the same way you do of oil and natural gas in terms of heating people's houses, powering electricity, and using automobiles, so that there's less pressure on the government to squeeze those industries for domestic consumption reasons. There's still the incentive to squeeze for revenue that always exists, but you at least don't have the trade-off between, as lithium prices rise, consumers pay more for oil and natural gas. In the elections, I mean, it varies by country, but the countries where it becomes most significant are places like Mexico. I mean, I wouldn't categorize what Venezuela is going to hold as actual elections in the true democratic sense. There may be an election, but it won't be fought based on energy policy. It'll be fought based on other issues and probably will not be even remotely fair. But places like Mexico and Argentina, energy does come up, but I think there's more of a national consensus there, and it's unlikely to see too much focus on, say, foreign investors and discussion of that, since it doesn't play too well politically.
Let's talk about geopolitical reality. After Russia invaded Ukraine and there were the sanctions put on Russian energy exports, you've got Europe, other places sort of scrambling around looking for how to meet their energy needs. What role do you see Latin America playing in meeting those geopolitical realities?
I'll let Francisco talk about the Maduro lifeline that provided.
Yeah, well, I think both Europe and the US changed a little bit their perspective on the regional policy after those events. Particularly the Europeans started to press heavily on the US on the idea that they had to concentrate on getting more resources from the region, and that, from the perspective of the European, included Venezuela as a potential source of, interestingly for the Europeans, is natural gas. Venezuela has this untapped, very significant potential of exporting, particularly through Trinidad, but even potentially on the other part of the country. And so that made for some sort of pragmatism. And I think, the US policy in the case of Venezuela was the policymakers wanted to make a change, but this gave them sort of an opportunity. And that's what resulted in the recent license to Chevron. The question, of course, is how far is this going to go? And I think, as Mark mentioned, it's unlikely that Nicolás Maduro will give any major significant political concessions, and that will limit what the advancement in that space. Other countries, Argentina, and Mark can talk deeply about Argentina, have this very significant potential to export LNG, but they are very far behind in the development of the infrastructure needed for that. And outside of Argentina and Venezuela, there isn't that much potential for natural gas. Their concern there is critical minerals and the role that China also might play in the region. And as Mark mentioned, the nature of mining is different than oil and gas in terms of how the politics plays. But there's a concerning development in the region also of resource nationalism. Chile announced that they will require government participation to develop lithium moving forward. It's unclear how that will develop. López Obrador said that he will nationalize lithium. And this region concentrates some of the largest copper and lithium and other minerals needed for the energy transition. So I think that's another concern. You could see it in the G7, the announcement of the countries want to focus on security of critical minerals. And a lot of it goes through Latin America.
And I think Francisco mentioned the failure of Argentina to take advantage of the Vaca Muerta's natural gas resources and potential. And it's a good, I think, metaphor and example of sort of the short-sighted focus of politicians in Argentina, in that building a natural gas pipeline to allow the Vaca Muerta exports to reach the city of Buenos Aires and province of Buenos Aires to effectively cover what now has to be imported during the Austral winter, and could then become a source of export revenue in the Austral summer and the Boreal winter. But they failed to take advantage of that by building the pipeline. It's now underway. Theoretically, it was supposed to be ready in June. Good luck if it won't be ready in time for the coming winter in Argentina, maybe in the fall. But by then, they're still going to be behind, because that's just one pipeline of many that need to be constructed. And that's the dilemma that I think undermines, especially in Argentina, but also Mexico, the ability to produce is investment. Because of either restrictions on foreign investment that are explicit, or because of the weak contracts and the fear of expropriation, either implicit or explicit, you're not getting the investment that you need to take full advantage of the production.
So let's talk about LNG. Is that a potential for any of the countries in Latin America, or?
Yeah, Argentina, clearly.
Yeah, I mean, currently only 2 countries in the region export LNG, which are Trinidad and Tobago, that has developed most of their resources, and their resources are declining, and that's why they want Venezuelan gas. And Peru, that has a project Camisea that is currently exporting as much as they can, taking advantage of the situation. But as Mark points out, Argentina is the country with the largest potential, but even the infrastructure that he just mentioned is mostly for the domestic market. I mean, they need to develop these LNG facilities, and that will take a significant amount of time and investment. The concern, of course, is one thing is to invest in Argentina, in short cycle shale, which you can invest $100 million, see how things go. And a very different thing is to invest in a massive facility to export LNG. So those are, I think, some of the concerns. And Mark can talk about what the election might bring in Argentina, but I think Latin America is not going to be a big provider of LNG in the near future. Venezuela has some significant potential too. That depends much more on these sort of negotiations. The U.S. just gave license for Trinidad to negotiate with Venezuela the potential to export LNG, and that might end up generating some export in, say, a couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, the fear with Argentina, if you're an investor, is you build that LNG export plant, and then the moment it's a fact on land and it becomes operational, then the Argentine government tries to figure out, okay, what are your operating costs? And then they say, okay, we will allow you to make enough profits that you'll cover your basic costs, not your return on investment, just your basic costs. And they'll probably overshoot it a little bit. So you actually will kind of be losing a little bit of money, but hoping that there'll be a new government someday. But since most companies can sort of project that out, the smart thing to do is never to invest. So the only way you're going to get that facility built is if the government does it, and they don't have the money or the resources to do it in the short to medium term. Even the pipeline, which they've had to do pretty much on their own, wrangling some domestic capital, get involved, has taken forever. I mean, this is something that should have been built 5 or 6 years ago, and it's not now even operational. And hopefully it will be by the fall here in the U.S.
Go back to Francisco, something you just said about the U.S. allowing permits for this export. I imagine there are a lot of people watching, throw myself in this category. What's the U.S. role in all of this? I mean, we're talking about Latin America, but what's the U.S. role and what happens in Latin America?
Sure. In the specific case of Venezuela, of course, the Trump administration imposed very harsh sanctions on the oil industry of Venezuela. And that's why any Western company, even non-Western, that wants to operate there usually has to be careful in not getting in crosshairs with the U.S. and the sort of OFAC, which is the U.S. Treasury Office that manages the sanctions process. So recent negotiations between the U.S. and the Maduro regime that led eventually to the approval of the Chevron license was sort of a first step in changing that regime. Then the Europeans have pressured very aggressively. They said, why the U.S. imposes sanctions and then only Chevron gets a license to export to the U.S.? What about us? And their priority, of course, is gas because of the LNG issue. And there are 2 companies, Eni and Repsol, that are interested in potentially, exporting natural gas too. But for now, the easiest thing will be to export through Trinidad, and Shell has a platform very close to the Venezuelan maritime border, and they will be the ones probably involved in exporting that LNG. But I can tell you, European governments, I receive often calls from European governments about, how fast this is going to happen, what needs to happen, what is the potential of Venezuela, because they don't see Argentina, unfortunately, as something that can happen in a short time. So politics, in this case, is mixed very heavily with energy policy, international politics.
So, yeah, not only Latin American politics, but U.S. politics,
Correct.
too.
Well, and the United States also really doesn't have the influence it used to have in South America. I mean, Venezuela plays something of a role, but it's not a non-entity, but it doesn't really exercise much influence in Brazil or Argentina or Chile, Bolivia. China is more influential there. If you have to say which embassy is more powerful, it's the Chinese embassy there. We still maintain our influence in Central America and Mexico, but I would say most of South America, we're not the presence we were 30 or 40 years ago.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. Each of you have a last comment you'd like to leave the audience with?
Well, I just think that Latin America has an important role to play in the energy transition. It's already one of the greenest energy matrices in the world, and it could be a place where, could serve as a carbon sink for the energy transition. But having said that, the politics of the region is potentially going to be tricky and problematic in achieving these significant goals that require attracting massive amounts of investment and occasionally also government investment. And the governments in the region, as Mark pointed out, have very short-term horizons. Incumbents are losing elections left and right in the region, so they are focusing on the next election a few months from now and not on these long-term policies that are required to generate credibility in the region.
So something you said is going to prompt me to alter this just a little bit. In your final comment, do the Latin American countries cooperate, work together at all? What do you see going forward?
Not pretty.
So work that into your last comment, I guess.
Well, I think what you're going to see, to the extent to which there's success in Latin America, it's going to be isolated success of specific cases in specific countries that, through a combination of luck, good fortune, good planning, good leadership, are able to break a negative cycle. But by and large, you're likely to see most of the countries continue to flail about and experience difficulties. And so it's going to be more finding those diamonds in the rough. Chile was one for quite a while. It maybe isn't anymore. Some countries will take their place, but by and large, if we're thinking about the region, I don't think the region is going to be a particularly optimistic place moving forward.
On that note, we will end the conversation. Baker Briefing is brought to you by the team at the Baker Institute for Public Policy. Baker Briefing is produced by Victoria Jupp and Shannon Moriarty. AV production is led by Kevin Young. Baker Institute for Public Policy provides meaningful policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing Texas, the U.S., and the world. It's a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy research organization based in Houston, Texas. To learn more, including how you can attend a live podcast recording on the campus of Rice University, visit us at bakerinstitute.org. Thank you for listening.